Hello, welcome to Elephant in the Room. These are short adventures in geography designed to make you think. This time, we're going to have a look at probably the biggest, baddest elephant in the room in human geography, inequality. Inequality is everywhere. Housing, food, water, energy. It's how we organise our societies and the basis of our politics. It affects our hopes and fears and how we think about the world. And it's so important to us that we've invented a special system to measure and manage it. Money and economics. Before we jump in though, there's something we need to get our heads around. The global economy is absolutely enormous. It makes about $100 trillion a year, from which taxes are drawn to pay for all our services and infrastructure, and the rest pays for all our other stuff. That $100 trillion a year is as big as it sounds, a vast river of money, practically a flood, really. It's enough for every man, woman and child on the planet to have an income of about $13,000 a year from the moment they're born to the moment they die. Or, to put it another way, a typical household income of around $60,000 a year. More than most households in rich countries live off, but all over the planet. That's just how much money is flowing through our economies, in and out of our collective pockets. And in terms of wealth, the ponds or lakes of this money, if you like, rich countries have managed to accumulate 5 to 10 years' worth of their total yearly income stashed away as largely private property and assets, while even desperately poor countries have at least some. The trouble is, although there's clearly a lot to go round, we don't all get equal access to this flood. And the vast majority of us, even in rich countries, rarely see this possible level of income and wealth. Instead, the lion's share goes to a tiny fraction of us, sometimes amassing insanely large fortunes, and that's a measure of our inequality. Normally, we'd go through some shocking examples of poverty and wealth and end up feeling all helpless and cynical. But this time, we're going to be good geographers and try to evaluate the levels of inequality we see in human systems. Are these levels in any way natural or inevitable or somehow useful? What levels should we be aiming for? What choices might we have? So let's start by looking at some of the common ways of measuring social and economic development, and then we can build up a clearer picture of where we are. The main indicator of development we use is economic, GDP per capita. This is the gross domestic product, the total value of goods and services produced by a country divided by that country's population. So a kind of average that reflects people's potential incomes. For example, in the UK, GDP per capita is about $40,000 a year. That's about double what you find in China and many South American countries, for example, and 5, 10, sometimes 50 times what you see in some African countries. But it's about half the GDP per capita of really wealthy places, like Luxembourg or Qatar or Singapore. So this gives us a sense of the scale of inequality between different countries. That $40,000 a year in the UK is quite a lot, more than many nurses or teachers make, but it hides substantial inequality at a national level. First of all, only about half the population are at work. The rest are babies or in education or have retired. So in terms of potential income, the real average is a lot higher, about $80,000 a year, more like a lawyer or a doctor. However, the most likely income in the UK is nothing like this, maybe $20,000 a year, so about a quarter of that average. And this is a pattern that's reproduced all over the world. So there is considerable inequality within countries as well. Imagine, though, if you did get that $40,000 a year. By the time you left school, and after taxes, usually around 50% overall, you'd have enough to buy yourself a pretty nice house to live in, all bought and paid for on your 18th birthday. Just think about that for a minute. That's another measure of just how much money is flowing through our economies and how different our lives might be if we decided to distribute it differently. But inequality is not just about how much you earn. It's also about health and education and access to resources like clean water and food and energy and the infrastructure and technology to improve your prospects and living conditions. So another commonly used indicator is called the Human Development Index, which attempts to integrate some of these diverse measures of development by looking at life expectancy, local income, and years spent at school. And this too shows significant inequality between different countries. Sticking with the UK, its Human Development Index is 0.932 out of 1. So it's close to the top, slightly lower than some European countries, but slightly higher than the US, for example. At the bottom of the scale are really low income countries like Afghanistan and Mali and Mozambique, where life expectancy, local income and years in education are much lower, and the Human Development Index is only around 0.4 or 0.5. And in fact, while this index includes other aspects besides income, it seems that many of these other aspects correlate with income anyway. Better incomes mean better diets, which means better health, for example. So ultimately, the Human Development Index follows a very similar pattern to GDP per capita. We see the same correlation with income for carbon dioxide emissions per person or environmental footprints per person, both of which are fairly direct measures of our economic activity. So how about looking at something else instead? Something we maybe really care about, our happiness. This is how Bhutan, a very poor Buddhist country in the Himalayas, decided to make its national decisions on the basis of gross national happiness rather than gross national product. In downtown Thimphu, the capital, they decided to put in a traffic light, the only one in the country, but it increased unhappiness, so they took it out again and went back to having a policeman to direct the traffic. Here's a map showing happiness, and that too seems to be generally related to income, where high-income countries tend to be happier, while low-income countries are not. One of the really interesting things about this, though, is that it's not just more money equals more happiness. Once people's basic needs are met, more money seems to make very little difference to their happiness, which begs the question, how might incomes be distributed if it was to maximize happiness, if we all took the Bhutan approach to economics? Okay, so there are a few ways we might measure development. So how do we quantify inequality in these things? Well, the way we do it is by calculating something called a Gini coefficient. Essentially, what this does is adds up your data one step at a time from the smallest to the largest, and then compares the curve you get to the straight line you'd get if all your data was the same. Complete equality gives a Gini coefficient of 0, and the more inequality there is, the higher the Gini coefficient gets, up to a maximum of 1. This is really handy because we can use it to compare the levels of inequality we see in different things. Let's look at some examples. South Africa has a fairly high GDP per capita by African standards, about $12,000 a year. But it also has the highest level of income inequality in the world. So South Africa has a high Gini coefficient for income, 0.63. By comparison, the Gini coefficient in the US is somewhat lower at about 0.42. But this is higher than in most European countries, where it's about 0.35. And it's lower still in Scandinavian and old communist countries at about 0.27. So the Gini coefficient shows that income inequality varies quite a bit. The average inequality within individual countries is around 0.4, but the difference between countries is bigger than that. This works out at about 0.53, so overall even more inequality between different countries than within them. For wealth instead of income, Gini coefficients paint a still more extreme picture, with global and national inequality averaging around 0.7. So quite a lot more inequality in wealth than even the most extreme inequality in incomes. In terms of access to resources, carbon dioxide emissions per person across the world have a Gini coefficient of about 0.6, and for environmental footprints per person, it's about 0.4. But look at happiness between different countries. That comes out at around 0.25, so apparently a lot less extreme than the distribution of money and resources. So that's a picture of the kind of inequality we see in human systems. Massive differences in wealth, pretty large differences in income and access to resources, but smaller differences in people's happiness. So then, how does this compare to natural systems? Well, here are a few examples of comparable situations in the natural world. The Gini coefficient for the home ranges, the territories of orangutans, a species closely related to us and busy farming their habitat a bit like we do, comes out at just over 0.2. So orangutan wealth and income is really equitable by our standards, more so even than our happiness. If orangutans have got their 14-million-year-old economies right, maybe Bhutan, with its gross national happiness, was really onto something. Or perhaps you think we're more like highly competitive, social top predators than a type of orangutan, so here's lions' home ranges. They come out at just under 0.3. Both these values integrate lots of variability, like seasonality and the productivity of those home ranges. We can get a sense of the influence of really huge natural variability by looking at the range of diets in mammals, the grams of food per gram of biomass, all the way from blue whales to the smallest shrew. This gigantic diversity and complexity comes out with a Gini coefficient of around 0.45. A similar picture emerges for the immense diversity of birds, from ostriches to bee hummingbirds. So our levels of economic inequality appear to be higher than this fundamental diversity in the whole of the mammal and bird kingdoms. Are our economies really more intricate and complicated than that? I'm pretty sure they're not. Perhaps a better natural comparison for human economies is photosynthesis as you go down through the canopy or descend through the surface layers of the oceans. Trees make the most of the sun's energy by organizing their photosynthesis from the top to the bottom, shading themselves out and optimizing access to light amongst their leaves, arranging their leaf inequality, if you like. This inequality, in grams carbon fixed per gram of chlorophyll or per leaf area, comes out at between 0.3 and 0.4. So this is the kind of level we might expect for more one-dimensional, super-efficient natural systems, quite a bit lower than the inequality apparent in our booming economies. Okay, so now we've got some idea about levels of inequality, we can have a look at how changes in these levels affects things, what these levels really mean. Here are the results of a very simple model of income inequality between all the countries in the world. All it does is transfer some of the excess income from richer countries to poorer ones, like a tax that reduces the Gini coefficient. But the results show us a few interesting things. First of all, just a very small reduction in the Gini coefficient from 0.53 to maybe 0.47 quickly removes extreme poverty, increasing minimum incomes with barely any change in everybody else's incomes. The tax required is just a few percent, so getting rid of extreme poverty hardly costs us anything. To decrease the Gini coefficient down to more natural levels, say 0.2 to 0.4, the tax level would have to increase up to about 30% and beyond, so quite large. This makes no difference to average incomes, of course, but starts eating into really high incomes as minimum incomes are increased. Eventually, as the Gini coefficient converges on zero, where there's complete equality, everybody's income would be about $13,000 a year. In this model, there's no change in the total amount of money flowing through the global economy, it's just distributed differently. But as the Gini coefficient changes and incomes are redistributed, it has some important consequences. For example, as the Gini coefficient decreases, the total human development index, the global average, increases, as does global happiness. There's a small reduction in global carbon dioxide emissions, but an increase in ecological footprints reflecting more environmental pressure per person. However, the global average birth rate decreases from about 2.5 babies per woman now to 2.1 babies per woman by a Gini coefficient of about 0.2, so orangutan level. That 2.1 babies per woman is critical. It's the birth rate where the global population stops growing. So reducing inequality may well turn out to be a big part of how we achieve sustainability. Some economists think there's a Gini coefficient where economic flow peaks, a kind of peak economic efficiency, maybe around these more natural inequality levels too, who knows. And this brings us to the heart of the issue for most people. Can we really afford lower levels of inequality? Wouldn't our standard of living be compromised? Well, here's a little summary map. it shows the global situation for a Gini coefficient of 0.3. You can see that richer countries, the purple ones, still have large excess incomes left over even after the costs of increasing incomes in red, poorer countries. So it's not that we can't afford to raise the standard of living of really large numbers of poorer people. It's really that we can't afford to keep the tiny number of very, very rich people as well. Okay, so this time I've got 2 tasks for you to choose from. The first is for those of you who disagree with what I've said, and I want you to carefully explain how and why you think it's wrong. Perhaps you feel that economic growth is the way forward, or that extreme wealth serves some important purpose. The second is for those who broadly agree with me, and I'd like you to think about what measures we could use to make our economies work better. Use the data in the links below if you like. It's up to you to choose what better actually means. But remember, this is one of those things where we really need to start using our imaginations. So anything goes, no matter how crazy it might sound. So hopefully all this gives you a useful frame of reference to think about inequality without getting too bogged down in politics and ideology. The main thing is, given just how much money is flowing through our economies, we probably have a lot more choices than we think we do. Thanks for listening. See you next time.